Alafia, I'm Dr. Gloria L, Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. I have two wonderful guests in the studio with me today, and we're going to talk about a topic that is so broad in its conceptualization and application that I actually had to invent a word to encompass what it is when we are talking about gender injustice or violence against girls and women. And I've invented this word called womanicide. Woman, homicide, infanticide, fratricide, genocide, womanicide, meaning crimes against women, the social oppression of girls and women. And we want to encompass all of these examples, and we want to talk about it in a way that will get your attention and get you involved. And I want to introduce the guest who brought this to my attention, Attorney Marian Perkins. I'm so happy to have you here. And I want to also welcome Queen Mother, Reverend Helen Sinclair. And Queen Mother, Reverend Helen Sinclair, is here because she knows a lot about the plight of our people, both men and women, both inside and outside of prison walls. So I want to ask, first of all, I want to tell Marian Perkins, who gave me this bio on her, that I knew her before she was born, so she really didn't have to give me this bio. But I know her as the daughter of Toussaint and Thelma Perkins and the niece of Eugene Perkins. And she comes from a very illustrious family, and I would not have expected anything other than what I'm seeing this young woman grow up to be, growing up to be an attorney and a university professor and a mother and a wife and wearing all these hats and then undertaking a mission. And it's her mission today that we want to approach. So you tell it, well, first of all, you've already been to Oxford to make the presentation. So tell us how you started this journey.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Peace, for inviting me, and it's an honor to be with both of you as well. Reverend Sinclair, very familiar with your work, and certainly your outstanding work, Dr. Peace. Yes, Oxford, the Oxford Roundtable hosts basically symposium on different topics that's held at the University of Oxford, in Oxford, England. And they decided that the topic would be gender and justice. And it was held from March 18th through March 28th, 2011 at Lincoln College on the University of Oxford. And they invited just various professors as well as lawyers and actually a couple of medical doctors, actually anyone who touched the lives of women and girls to this particular session. There were professors from Canada, South Africa, Nigeria, and certainly I was one of the professors from America, and they had an attorney, the Wayne County prosecutor from Detroit, and a medical doctor from Stony Brook, New York. At Chicago State University, where I teach in the Criminal Justice Department, I'm the one who teaches the course Women in Criminal Justice. So in that course we look at women as victims, and women and girls as victims of crime, women and girls as offenders, and women working in the profession, and many times find a blurring of the roles, meaning that many times people who have been victims then become offenders, and then sometimes become victims, but then sometimes through resilience and transformation are able then to be able to come back and give to the community. So there's a lot of hopefulness in it. So anyway, to make a long story short, I went to Oxford, and the topic that I presented on was the human trafficking of girls and women in the United States and abroad. Because when we think of human trafficking, we may probably think of it occurring in primarily, we think of it occurring abroad, but it does occur in the United States as well. So I presented on that topic. When I was as a former prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, I actually prosecuted domestic violence cases and worked with the victims as much as possible. It's a really interdisciplinary type of a situation, so the legal field does the best that it can to stop it, yet certainly the women need a lot more assistance, but the law does at least try to at least get the offender to stop temporarily, to get the order of protection, and then for the woman to try to move on to some other things. So anyway, I will bring all of that. I brought all that to bear in my presentation. But that's what happened.
That was the beginning of your journey.
Yeah, that was the beginning of my journey, and it just kind of brought together so many things that I did in my legal career and as a professor at Chicago State. So I was honored to be selected. I don't know, they selected people, but I think it was because I teach the course Women in Criminal Justice. I'm actually a woman in criminal justice and a former prosecutor and a defense attorney.
Reverend Helen Sinclair, you are a chaplain at Joliet.
Well, Illinois Department of Corrections.
Illinois Department of Corrections. Your work is primarily with men. You have done some work with women.
Well, we still work with Dwight, and then when they started in Jesse Mount Houston Community Corrections, that was for women.
All right.
They named it after my mom, and they tried to have that kind of philosophy on how to treat people. But you know what? I am so excited that the Spirit brought me here, because I have wondered who was the criminal justice professor at Chicago State.
Well, there she is.
Isn't that wonderful?
Well, I mean, there are others. But
I asked the president, and he said, "Oh, I know we have it," but I had a friend there who looked up a lot of things from Professor George Knox.
Yes, Dr. Knox.
So
when I had a prison ministry, very rarely did I have an opportunity to address the women. And one of the problems that I saw that they were having, in addition to the fact that they were incarcerated, and very often they were incarcerated for, it seemed, extremely lengthy sentences for crimes that, if you talk about disparities, so we talk about the disparity between the whites being sentenced for the same crime as the blacks, and the blacks have longer sentences. I saw that same thing, that same pattern in women. Women were more readily incarcerated for crimes that men were not incarcerated from, and served longer prison sentences. And I saw that, first of all, just that. And then the next thing I saw was a lot of confusion, because I think that the prison experience has to create some confusion around your sexuality. And so I began to see what I thought was women who were forgetting that they were women, who were not asserting their womanhood, and there was probably a defense mechanism as much as it was anything else. But women trying to have the countenance, trying to have the appearance, trying to swagger and trying to behave in ways that were definitely unfeminine. But of course, not being incarcerated myself, I had no idea what conditions would promulgate that kind of behavior. But it was disturbing to me, because I knew that a large number of women incarcerated were mothers. And so if they lost their mother's intuition and instinct, if they lost that orientation, then we would suffer that loss even when they would be released. So my concern was always to talk to women about their womanhood, because I wanted to make sure that if their freedom had been taken and they were suffering all of this discrimination and injustice and abuse, but don't give up your womanhood.
Well, you brought a lot back to me. I mean, I'm remembering so many things, because when Carol Mosley Braun and all those women were in Springfield, they invited me down there years ago, because that's the question they ask. Is there a difference in what happens to the women and the men? And I said, yes, there is, and they wanted to know why. And one of the reasons that I found out why that the women got more of a sentence for the same crime was that the men judges saw the women as mothers and wives and they just felt like they shouldn't be doing what they were doing. And so that's how they sentenced them. They were sentencing them more, not for what they were doing, but because in their eyes, they shouldn't have been doing it. And so they were giving them more time. And so I was very honored when they asked me to come and talk to all the women in legislatures one morning about 7 a.m. And I said, oh, yes, I've been around. I've seen them do that. Then when the women were incarcerated in Dwight, in the beginning, they could sort of dress up, but then the brothers sort of gotten a little bit nervous, not nervous, but jealous as the years went by. And I said, why is it that people, when they have a problem, they'll try to make somebody else have that problem? They were allowing the women to look nice. You know, you could go there and the women have on makeup, earrings, some nice clothes. But then the men said, why can they do that and we can't? And I said, that sounds so selfish to me. They should have been happy if the women could wear those things. Because like you said, they're losing femininity if they can't wear them. So the first thing they did was make some funny looking white shirts where the buttons kept breaking all off and people had to start complaining. And I remember a lot of us had to go down there, like some of the legislatures, Carol Moser Brown, but then I'm thinking about Connie Howard. And I think Jackie Jackson went down there a couple of times. So we had to start trying to see if they could change even what they were wearing. Because in the other days, they could do each other's hair. They could wear makeup. And they could look nice when the people came to visit them. But they still think that women are supposed to be mothers and they should not be getting into the same trouble the men were. Although they were following the men getting into trouble. Right. But the men were not there to say, well, let them look nice even if we can't do that.
Well, research has borne out your statement, Reverend Sinclair. I had read about a research study that kind of divided it into evil women, whether or not chivalry or paternalism was used in the court, or whatever we mean by equal treatment. And you totally are correct that because of we can say it's a good stereotype to be a wife and a mother, or what is perceived as a feminine woman, that if in fact that person is then doing something bad, which is even theft or retail theft, that the judge is like, well, I'm going to sentence you more harshly than I would the man, because I'm expecting more out of you, and so then the woman ends up with a harsher sentence. And so it's almost like the judge is using you call it the evil woman. Now there are times when sometimes the judge will use chivalry or be paternalistic, and so the woman will get lesser time than the man. But so many times when you talk about women and girls and crime, the system has borne out this disparity that Dr. Peace has talked about, but which you've talked about, and the research has borne it out. It's quite interesting. And just as there's a movement there's a big movement certainly in terms of the racial disparity. In fact, I was one of several people that Governor Quinn had to deal with this whole issue of racial disparity, but this whole issue of gender disparity has not been looked at the way it needs to be. But you all are raising some really good points. I know this one young lady my daughter used to work for that has Chicago's legal aid to incarcerated mothers. Oh yeah, they're great. And also Decatur, Illinois, and Debbie Denning is over all the women's programs. She loves for us to come there because that's where they had to raise their own money so that mothers could have their children with them. The state doesn't pay for it, so they have to raise that money so that they can have their children with them, and they have a room, and everybody, and some people came and volunteered and decorated and brought baby furniture and all of that. But those are things that women had to fight to get.
And we still need to fight, because one of the things that we have to recognize early on in this discussion is that misogyny, which is the hatred of women, is part and parcel of this culture. And it goes back, you said something 56 BC, before Christ. Well, whenever I'm reading, I'm discovering that there's a book called The Iceman's Inheritance. Before that, there was another book called Works and Days. The Iceman Inheritance underscores this whole idea of misogyny, the hatred of women. But Works and Days by Hesiod just is the most disturbing book, because what it shows is that there was a point in time when Europeans did not really know what the function and purpose of a female was. And so they thought, because the woman differed in the fact that she bore children and had a menstrual cycle, it made her some sort of other species. So they didn't relate to women as their counterpart. In other words, the female counterpart of the masculine, because this was some other kind of creature, another species. And so there was a long period of time before men could relate to women, in which, and during that period, you get the mythology called Pandora's box. You know, women were responsible for all the evils in the world. Pandora was given this box and trusted with it. It had all the worries of the world. She was told not to open the box, but her curiosity overcame her. She opened the box and she let out all the worries into the world. Or in the biblical sense of, you know, Eve in the Garden of Eden. You know, Adam was behaving himself.
All right.
Eve was either weak or dumb. And so she let something of another species convince her that she should disobey her creator, and got them thrown out of the Garden of Eden. So you have, in the literature, going back as far as we can read, we have these stories about women who have caused all the worries of the world. So that's part and parcel of the culture. This distrust, this dislike, this distaste for, this fear of the female gender is underlying all of this, and it doesn't fly when you try to say the reason that they did this to the women was because they expected. No, the reason that they do these things to women is because they don't like women. And so we have to get with that. Just get with the idea that pervasive in this culture is a dislike and fear of women. That's underpinning all the rest of the stuff. So now once we get that, lay that premise down, now we can talk about what happens to women in a culture where they are loathed. And especially what happens to the most undesirable woman in this culture, which is the black woman. Undesirable on the surface, but given the facts that we have mulattoes and octoroons and quadroons and all these other complexions, we know that the black woman is a highly desired woman. But to let the press tell it, this woman is the lowest woman, lowest female on the totem pole. So we got all that to contend with. We've got the misogyny, the hatred, and then we've got the discrimination and the injustice and all of these other things that take all these forms. And we could start with pedophilia. We could start with the rape and molestation of little innocent girls.
Yes, you're raising, you just said so much, Dr. Peace. I don't know where to begin, except to say that we need to start with the babies and very, very young children, because believe it or not, in terms of who is most likely to be a victim of child sexual abuse, it is between the ages of 0 and 3. The perpetrators, the offenders, what they're looking for is to make sure that they've got a victim who's not going to be able to say anything, who's not going to be able to identify. And we know certainly even with very young children, they're going to go to a person, they're giving them the candy, they're kind of luring them in. And even when you start talking about teenage girls, we think that they are mature at 14, 15, and 16, but they are very afraid, they're very lured in as well. So when we talk about what is occurring, we're talking about lots of girls who are victimized, and so their experiences of socialization just with both men and women, because once they are victimized like that, it affects how they interact with women to women, women to girls, as well as women to boys, and women to men. So it's the most traumatic thing. So we spend so much time, no disrespect, to trying to prosecute drug cases. I'm not going to say that we know that drug case. We've had the war on drugs since the 1980s. The United States now has we are the most highly incarcerated country in the nation, in the global community,
Right.
whether or not you're talking about per capita or whatever, and most of the people being incarcerated for drug cases, no disrespect to those convictions, but knowing that the silent crimes of sex abuse really still are not being prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I think people would feel like their tax dollars are going a further way if you're really going to try to get people off the street who are really, really hurting society versus someone who has unlawfully possessed, it's wrong to do it, 2.2 grams of crack cocaine, which is not to say that they should do it, but that fits the profile of a lot of people that are in prison.
Right.
So the young children are the victims, and it's the holy grail that you can't touch, because it's hard. You can't get a prosecution, you can't get a conviction many times
because you can't get reliable testimony.
Right.
Because they're questioning always whether or not this child has been coached.
Correct.
Whether this child
Right.
could possibly know what has been perpetrated against her.
Yes, absolutely.
And with the launching of a libido in a child, the sexual energy is a powerful energy. It will run away with the organism, which it will run away with the child. It will run ahead of the child. When Oprah Winfrey talks about how she became promiscuous after having been sexually abused, that's a
absolutely,
pattern. You
that
can
is the
predict it.
pattern.
If you can abuse a young child and arouse that libido over which they have no ration and no power, then that libido is going to be on its own, and it will be the tail wagging the dog from that point on. So
Plus the girls
damage,
don't feel like anything, so they're just going to give out their bodies. They're not making love, which is a good thing. They're just, my body is here just to be treated any old kind of way. It's a horrible thing.
One of the institutions that I visited when Mr. Snyder was the director, he put a certain kind of clinic. I don't know. It's probably a prison. I don't know what it was, but anyway, I went there, and they had. They said you will have 800 boys to come to your Black History. He said, but one of those groups are going to be sex offenders, and the other group is going to be people that have a little mental problem. And so when we went in there, I had to really do something. I was by myself too, and I had to entertain. I had to do everything to get their attention, the ones that were on medicine. But what really surprised me, and shouldn't have, was all of those that they said were mental were from the suburbs. All of those that they said were sex offenders was from Cook County. And in my mind, I said, I bet that some of those young men had no idea that they were doing something to put them in there. I said, I bet some of them were just with girls, you know, because they had no idea. And I said, and when I saw all of them were from Cook County, I said, all these young men now they have to put sexual on their whatever they fill out from now on. They'll have to put that on there. And in my mind, I had an idea. They had no idea what the crime was.
Wow.
They had no idea. And I said, I don't know how we can help them with that, because that was a new thing that Mr. Snyder did. But each one who comes, they do something. I don't know if that's still there. It's just so much you want to try to research, but you can't do it all.
Exactly. And you want to protect the victims. That's why we have the Child Sex Offender Registration Act, and it's a community notification act. And as we know in Illinois, they actually put the photograph of the convicted person. You can see their picture and their address on the internet. Yet there has been some discussion about possibly taking out of the statute the young men who do engage in the statutory rape, which is not to say that it's not wrong, because it is wrong, but they also have to register for the rest of their life as well. So,
but you have to register if you had someone under 17 somewhere in whatever crime you committed. It has nothing to do with sex, and you still have to be a sex offender.
Right, but if there's some improper touching of sexual,
some of them that didn't happen. It just happened if they stole a car.
Oh, okay.
Somebody was in there 17 or under, they still had to register as a sex offender.
So
some when they would get out of prison to come home to their mama's house, they couldn't go there. And I said, wait a minute. So they said, nobody was in my car under 17. They have to go back and prove that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because you do
it didn't
have to
have nothing to do with sex.
It's definitely got to be a conviction, either criminal sexual abuse, criminal sexual assault, aggravated criminal sexual assault. So
it's so many things people go to prison for.
Yeah,
in our community especially.
Well, when you talked about, you know, how people relate to their partners and to other women and so forth, it also has to do with how people relate to themselves. Because once you have created that kind of confusion, whether or not I am guilty, whether or not I contributed something, what did I wear something, did I say something, did I have some mannerisms, what did I do to attract this attention to me? So people go through their lives. Now we're getting people writing books and coming out to tell their stories. Sugar Ray Leonard is now out talking about the abuse that he suffered, because people have like these, what they think are demons. They have these dark thoughts and ideas about themselves. They see themselves as unworthy and so forth, because they have been victims. That's the hardest part of it, to see victims blaming themselves for their own victimization.
Absolutely.
And yet this is so pervasive in this society, because we have this society where there's a fear and dislike, detest of black people. Then the same thing applies to women who are black, women of color, as you want to say that. And then, you know, one of the poets that I think a lot of spoken word poets says, America eats her children. The abuse that children themselves experience. Your uncle, Eugene Perkins, wrote the book that I consider to be the Bible for understanding what is happening to black children. It's called Home is a Dirty Street, The Social Oppression of Black Children. And he talked, he had to invent some words to talk about it. He talks about a get colony. He said black children not only grew up in a ghetto, but they grew up in a colony where everything that goes on in that colony is controlled by forces outside of it. So he had to come up with some terms, some language, to try to explain to us the oppression of our children. So when we narrow it down and start talking about the females, then it surprised me, for example, to find out that males were being raped. The first time I heard that, I could not get, what is this?
Because it's still about power and control. So, for example, they will talk about, some of the boys will say it's a female babysitter, so it's somebody a little bit older who has a little bit more power and control.
Or a male raping a boy.
Absolutely.
You know, and then, of course, then you begin to see, and I saw this as a young girl. I had a friend who had brothers, and one of the brothers had been sexually abused. We didn't know that at the time. Later we learned it. He went from being one of the most sought-after boys. It effeminized him. He started to behaving. He started to we wanted be with him, you know, and walk with our arms linked, you know, be a girlfriend. He wanted to do all the stuff we wanted to do. He wanted to play hopscotch and jump double dutch and do all the stuff that the girls were doing. So it effeminized him, that experience. I saw that with my own eyes. So here we have pedophilia running rampant in the society. We have victims of pedophilia who are now turning on themselves because they blame themselves for what is happening to them. So we have that as that as one of the things that happens to children. Then we just can go ahead and talk about the physical abuse, you know, the actual beating and punishment and confinement and deprivation that young people can experience at the hands not only of their parents, but since we have increasing numbers of young people in foster homes, then we seem to be, is that proliferating, or is that just my guess that children who don't belong to the people who are taking money for taking care of them don't get treated as well.
No, you're totally correct. You're hitting on so much. One point that there has been a study over time, a 50-year study about the effects of spanking. Now we're talking about very severe spanking. Some people, when they're spanking their child, it's like, we're not talking about just a little tap or whatever. Then sometimes you're hugging your child, explaining why you shouldn't steal the candy or whatever. Like, for example, I was with somebody, they were in the store, they didn't realize that candy, like that Brock's candy that's out, it's just out in the, but it looks like it's free, but I'm like, it's not free. And so then you look up, the person has taken it, you want to let them know right away that that's stealing. But anyway, the point of the study and the point of what I'm talking about is that the introduction to violence occurs very early in almost all of the families throughout the culture, and that severe spanking has had the side effects of early aggression, early improper responses to other people and human behavior. So what people do have to be properly taught as early as possible about how to actually treat another human being. So this show that you have spearheaded, someone looking at it may say that it sounds like it's negative, but it's really important to expose it, bring it all out in the open, the violence, the patriarchy, what's happening to the children, what's happening to the women, so that it is exposed, because it makes the victims of it feel much better that they're being heard, and potential perpetrators know that there's someone looking at you. So it kind of makes everybody feel a little bit safer. So it's a good thing that you're doing. But I'm sure someone looking at the show is like, wow.
Well, this is serious business. People talk about think positive and all that kind of stuff. There's a time and a place for everything. When you're talking about people being oppressed and abused, then there's what's positive about that?
That's right, and you can't sugarcoat it.
And Queen Mother Sinclair, I know you've heard the expression "cowered down."
Yes.
Abuse often has that effect, doesn't it? It makes people afraid to defend themselves, and even after they leave a situation in which they have been abused and beaten, they will get a woman who has been manhandled and mistreated in her home will probably allow her husband to do the same thing, or allow her boyfriend to do the same thing, because somehow she has gained the notion that she is powerless and that other people can punish her for her transgressions. And my father taught me something very early on, and this might be negative teaching, but I like it. And he said he didn't care what anybody discovered that he was doing. He would not allow you to whip his you-know-what for it. So, you can't chastise me, is what my father would say. So that women, young girls especially, need to be taught that people cannot chastise them just because they are male, just because they are older. To accept violence against oneself is to set up a pattern of behavior where violence is more than likely to be a part of your life. What do you say to that, Mother?
I couldn't handle it. As a little bitty girl, sometimes I would hear people up over, in these 3 flats, and I said, when I get grown, I'm not going to ever have anybody doing that to me. And I really meant that. And I know that I was married, and my husband, he was very young, and I didn't even know he drank. And so he started trying to fight because he would be out doing something, I don't know what, and he would come in guilty. And when he knew anything, I had gotten a divorce. He was crying. And his auntie said, "I'm sorry, but she's through because she told you." I said, I didn't argue. And I felt I was unfair because I didn't tell him. I said, "I'm not going to stay here with this man. He hit me, that's it." And I wouldn't have got. But I felt sorry for some of my children, my girls, and some other young. I said they didn't ever have anybody who was nice to them, and that it's so sad. That everyone that they get, they can't think of anything that they did to them nice, because some people think if they hit people, it means they love them, and I could never see that.
Yeah, that was out there in the culture too. I heard a woman once say, "A man don't love you if he don't hit you."
Oh, poor lady.
And I thought, well, he got to find another way.
Absolutely. Oh.
Yeah. So you did mention patriarchy.
Patriarchy is defined as male domination of women, and inherent in that situation dealing with control is the emphasis on power and profit. And so much of this whole situation of domination of women and girls is rooted in patriarchy. When we think about the role of the law in 56 BC, before Christ, there was a law called the Laws of Chastisement. And when we think of chastising, you think of chastising a child. However, the law was written, and it actually gave the authority for a husband to beat his wife in the name of chastising her because there's something that she hasn't done, either washed the dishes or picked up some clothes or whatever. But even if she hasn't done that, it's amazing that a law like that would pass, but it did. And it set the train running for basically the male domination of women, because the women that were allowed to be abused, and under the law they had no recourse. And as we know, most of the states in the United States of America did not get its formal domestic violence laws until the 1980s. And so Illinois got its Illinois Domestic Violence Act in 1986. That's AD. So to know that you're having this type of feelings about women going all the way back to BC and it then being codified under the law, it gives a lot of credence, gave a lot of power to the men who did want to be abusive, because they knew that nothing was going to happen to them for doing it.
I just want to add one more P, because you said patriarchy and power were aligned. Property was aligned. The fact that private property was held by men and women could not hold, could not own anything, made women subject to the authority of men, because they had to depend on men for everything. So now in that time period, and certainly patriarchy has not vanished, that is the basis of this culture. In that time period, it makes more sense than it does now, because now you have propertied women, but you still have patriarchy moving right along, like the women are still subject to the authority of men, because men have the property, men have the livestock, they have the real estate, they have the money, they have everything. So at some point, it kind of, I'm thinking of it like the Juneteenth, when some of the captives they call slaves in America discovered that there had been an emancipation proclamation, but they didn't know it, and so they were still being treated like chattel and behaving like chattel. So apparently, women do not yet know that they are not all entirely dependent on men. However, we are all subject to laws being made by legislators who are predominantly male. So they're sitting in Congress in Washington or in Springfield making these laws which subject women to these extensive prison sentences and all of this other kind of victimization, very often because men are not women. They do not feel like women. They don't experience life as women do. And so the compassion that women can feel for other human beings, Margaret Mead said, and she's a great sociologist, and she said that men, because they do not have the birth experience, because the child does not grow inside of them, never can pick up that compassion that women experience. You know, so the best they can do is you know, fake it till they make it, I guess you can say.
Well, we believe a person certainly can have, you know, empathy. We know that there are many men who do have empathy for the movement, and some women who don't as much. So
but the thing is that the fact that men held sway over women for centuries because everything was owned by them and nothing was owned by women, gave them, undergirded their authority, but their authority is certainly should be less now that not only do they not own everything, but what they do own is, the market says, is worth less than it did prior to now.
Right. Well, that's true. Well, we look at the decision that was just handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court in the whole class action suit that women had filed against Walmart, which is the biggest corporation in the United States of America. And in that particular case, the three female U.S. Supreme Court justices, it was a 5-4 decision. It was actually a close decision, and the three women appointed by different presidents of the United States voted, meaning that they did not believe that the case should have been dismissed against Walmart. Just as a little bit of summary, the case actually came out of the West Coast, the Ninth Circuit of the United States District Court, and that United States District Court of Appeals, the Ninth Circuit, actually upheld the arguments of the women, where for whatever reason 2/3 of the managers were men and 2/3 of the lowest paid workers were women. And there had appeared to have been some pattern substantiated enough that the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit believed that there was enough to go forward. However, Walmart certainly had the right to appeal. Under the law, they did. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we know the makeup of the court. There are 9 members. There are 3 females, but those 3 females looked at the case, analyzed the brief, listened to the oral arguments, and came down on the side of saying it's quite interesting that 2/3 of the workers are, lowest paid workers are the women, and 2/3 of the managers, people making the money, are the men. So we have to deal with the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the highest court of the land. And we don't know if there's going to be some legislation to deal with, you know, pay equity again in the U.S. Senate and in the House of Representatives.
And, you know, I'm harking back to what Mother Sinclair said about judges saying that sometimes the harsher sentences come because these are women. They're seen as wives and mothers, and they should not behave in this manner. But when you consider the roles that wives and mothers have to take, because so many of our men are absent from the home because they are incarcerated, because they are not alive, because they are fighting in wars, for all kinds of reasons, women are assuming the roles that men traditionally filled of being female heads of households. And consequently, when you have to perform in a role, that makes for a difference in the way you look at the world and the way in which you solve your problems. And when you feel responsible for your children on both sides of the fence, in other words, when you are these children's mother, as well as acting in the role of these children's father, don't say how a woman is not supposed to behave, because she is going to protect those children no matter what she has to do. And many women will tell you, these children are going to eat no matter what I have to do, and you fill in the blank. Because they're not going to behave like helpless, fragile women when so much is at stake.
That's why they came together and fought for more money, so that working at Walmart, so that they could take care of their of their children. So they are applauded for pushing for the fight.
We have to now go to the human trafficking. We just have to go there. So talk to us about that. That was the topic of your presentation in Oxford.
Yes, yes. I'll give a brief definition. I'm not going to read the paper, but human trafficking is the organized movement of people, usually women and girls, between countries and within countries, often for sexual exploitation. It is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world today. The other two large criminal industries that take place throughout the world are drug trafficking and arms trafficking. Never did we think that we would be dealing with trafficking of people.
Right.
It's enough that the drugs and the guns are being trafficked. That's caused such a havoc throughout our country and so many other countries. But now we are looking at and facing the reality of women and girls being treated as property. And the way it works is that there is a country of origin that provides the source of the women and girls, a country of transit, and a country of destination. So just as when you think of any type of a crime where there's somebody in the car, in the getaway car, there's somebody else who gets out of the car at first and does one thing, everyone has a particular role. I know we may find it hard to believe, but we have countries that are considered undeveloped countries, along with countries and that have a high amount of poverty, along with countries that are highly industrialized and technologically sophisticated, like America, like London, etc., where human trafficking is taking place. And what is happening, the countries that are countries of destination, which is for the most part United States of America, they are actually turning a blind eye to the countries where there is more poverty and taking those girls and exploiting them. So that's why revealing this whole situation of human trafficking is also revealing just a situation of power imbalance and then power abuse, again for the purpose of profit. The issue is why does it happen? You use the word misogyny. I've used the word patriarchy, but it definitely is a cultural theme in terms of that the women and the girls are basically considered chattel, and so that's why they're treated the way they are. The other thing is that, for example, people would think, well, it could not be happening today, right up under our noses, but it is. There's something that used to be called white slave trafficking, also known as sex trafficking, that occurred in the early 1900s, and it wasn't called white slave trafficking because most of the girls were Caucasian. Some people, think that it was that, or that the people came from the Caucasoid countries, even though I'll talk about that in a moment. It's just that it was called white slave trafficking anytime it involved sex trafficking, because I do want to make it clear that human trafficking does involve labor trafficking, where you're trafficking men as well for the workers, but I primarily, in my paper, when I was talking about at Oxford, was human trafficking for sexual exploitation reasons, which 90% of those victims are women and girls, and again, putting a lot of emphasis on the girls, that the perpetrators like the people young. They really like to take advantage of them. And when I talk kind of briefly about who the perpetrators are, we'll find out that they're not only just men, but that the men also pay certain women to lure in the girls, because sometimes the girls may not go with the men. People are being educated more and more and more, so what better way than to have a nice lady lure the person in, and then they come on, and then that woman turns that person over to the man. So human trafficking is a big thing that is occurring around the globe and in the United States of America, and we're trying to decide how do we get at the root of the problem? There are some laws on the books. There's the United Nations Convention, and we know that when we have United Nations conventions, the countries have agreed that we should not have this, but nevertheless it doesn't have the force and effect in terms of what are you going to do to the perpetrator. But there are almost all of the countries have signed on to United Nations protocol to end trafficking around the globe. That was passed in 2000 at Palermo, Italy. And that was actually part of the protocol that deals with organized crime. So when you're looking at human trafficking, you're looking at it in the context of an organized crime type of a situation.
You know, when I think about this, and I think about, you know, what we used to call the Atlantic slave trade, which I call the Atlantic captive trade, because they were capturing people and forcing them into slavery, not capturing slaves. That was human trafficking. So, you know, the precedent for human trafficking has long since, you know, been laid. But here you have a situation in which you say this is organized activity. It means that there are some people who are in the business, as certainly there were back in the days when you had chattel slavery. People who are in the business of capturing, because obviously people would not give their children and would not volunteer to move into a position where they could be exploited in that way. So people are being captured and they are being is this called extraordinary rendition? Because, you know, when you just swipe somebody up off the street and they just disappear, you know, in some cases it's called extraordinary rendition. So you're capturing people and you're transporting people, you know, right in view of everyone else, but somehow it doesn't look as though it's a kidnapping.
Right.
And then and these people are turning up in other communities, and no one is asking any questions about where these people who do not look like the rest of the people in this community are coming from. That says that a whole lot of people in high places are not just turning a blind eye, but they are profiting, they are benefiting from this human trafficking. You know, and so how do you find the root of it? The root of it, again, power, profit, patriarchy, misogyny, that's where the root of it is. What do we need to do? We need to pay close attention to our children. We cannot allow our children to be vulnerable so that they can be in a position where people who do not have our best interests at heart can compromise them and seduce them and lure them, which means that we got to be a family and a community. That, wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, you know, a while back, like several years ago, we were hearing a lot about the slavery. And I was in Israel one time, and we was going on a tour in Old Jerusalem, and they told everybody, hold on to your children. So there was one young boy with us, about 8 or 10 years old, and he turned his father's hand loose, and somebody grabbed him. And his father said, wait a minute, that man tried to grab me. And so I said, you have to be careful everywhere you go now, because people was just snatching people's children. So if nobody had been with him, that little boy would have been gone. And one of the things that I thought about when they had the, was it tsunami? What's the one where all the people got swept away?
The tsunami in...
that's where they were doing, that's what they had over there. That's what they had over there.
A lot of Haitian children disappeared after the earthquakes and
there was a lot of people over there.
Both Haiti and the Asian and the Pacific Island countries and East Asia. In fact, the Asian countries, it's one of the, it occurs quite a bit, one of the highest amount. And when we're talking about all over the world, we mean all over. So we're talking about West Africa, Senegal, Ghana, we're talking about East Africa, South Africa, and then North Africa, where you're going to have countries like Saudi Arabia, and I'll talk about this in a moment. The United States of America now has a statute which tries to put pressure on countries to get certain trafficking laws, and what they do, they try to tie the countries passing the law to government aid or things, government, to tie it to government funding. And what will happen is, whenever you have a law, though, there are many times waivers are granted or exceptions are granted. And unfortunately, because of some, quote unquote, some of the bigger countries, the United States of America has to deal with them. So Saudi Arabia is a real big one. They're considered a tier 3 country, meaning that they have no trafficking laws, and yet they have evidence of a lot of human trafficking occurring. Certainly Saudi Arabia is in North Africa, and yet the United States of America granted them a waiver for, in terms of, and still said we've got to still give them for some particular governmental funds because they are a partner with the United States of America. So when you start talking about human trafficking, it does get tied to some of the global issues that are going on. So everyone may say that they do want to solve this crime, but then there's a but if in fact it has an impact on a particular nation's economy. So that's what's happening too. Profit over people. How far are we going to go?
Right. Yes. And then when we think about, and you said you were going to say something about another issue in a minute. Well, in a minute we're not going to be on this show. We're going to be on another one. But there's something about having your fate lie in the hands of legislators who are not representative, who are not like you, who do not come from your ethnic group, who do not come from your socioeconomic group. You know, millionaires making decisions for poor people and so-called middle class people. There's a real problem with thinking that a group of men are going to make decisions that are favorable to a group of women.
Right.
So that's why I'm saying we have to become a community and a family while the other people who have the power and authority get their act together. Because, you know, our African proverb is, children are the reward of life.
Right.
We have nothing more valuable than our young. There's no property that we could own, and everybody understands the value of our children better than we. They commodify our women, they commodify our children because they know that they're valuable. They put them, they incarcerate them and make lots of money in the prison industrial complex, I guess you would call it, because they know the value. We must learn the value and assert the value of our children, so much so that we protect them like a mother hen protects her chicken.
Yes.
She will give her life.
Yes, absolutely.
Will give her life.
They
I'm so glad
they are priceless. Yes.
I'm so glad, Attorney Perkins and Mother Helen Sinclair, that you were here to have this discussion. This is not the end of this discussion because it continues. The practice continues.
It does.
Thank you so much.